Hey, everybody, and welcome to Incorruptible Mass. We are here to help everybody understand what's going on in state politics. We try to shed light on how broken things are right now, what we can do to fix it, and just understand sort of the systemic stuff behind it. So today we are going to talk about our crisis in American democracy, a deep topic. Pretty excited about it. I am, of course, as always, joined by my lovely co-hosts, Jordan Berg Powers.
My name is Jordan Berg Powers. I use he, him, and I work in electoral politics.
And Jonathan Cohn.
Yeah, Jonathan Cohn, have he, him, working with, doing stuff with issue and electoral advocacy in Massachusetts, especially in Boston, for a number of years. Yeah, joining from Boston.
Awesome. I'm Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. And to start this off, I'm just going to say a few kind of statistics that I pulled out of news articles about what is happening with our democracy, right? So we had a very contentious 2020 election, and there's a whole lot of people that continue to believe that that election was not legitimate, despite no evidence of any kind of widespread voter fraud. Lawmakers in 47 states have introduced legislation making it harder to vote. And in 19 states, that much legislation has passed. Negative partisanship, which is how much the voters from one party dislike and distrust the voters from another party, not just the legislators, but the people on the ground. It is at its highest level in decades. And there are people who really cite this as kind of a prelude to democratic collapse. Affiliation as an independent has risen for 40 years. That's way higher than either party's affiliation. Really high disapproval of the job Congress is doing. The US is ranked 31st out of 35 countries for voter turnout. There was an NPR poll finding that about 64% of Americans believe that the US democracy is in crisis and at the risk of failing. And the one final thing I'll mention is about inequality, that researchers in inequality understand that when it gets really high, it triggers political unrest. And in America, inequality before COVID was at its highest point since 1929. It has skyrocketed in the last 2 years. And globally, just since in 2020 alone, billionaires gained over $3 trillion and workers lost $3 trillion. So our level of inequality is like bonkers. And so we're really at a crisis point in democracy. And so we are going to just jump in. We're going to talk about what does this mean? Like, why is this happening? Did this only happen in the last 4 or 5 years? Is this something that's been going on for a long time? Who wants to jump in first? Don't all jump in at once.
I guess I'll just start by saying I feel like those of us who were around and protesting during the George W. Bush time and were saying that this was, the Republican Party was sliding into fascism, and the like, you're either with us or against us, and the language that they were using and so forth, and people were alarmist. And one of the things that drove me crazy is that really, there was this dumb. I've never liked this thing where people said like, oh, all, the sort of rule about like, if an argument falls into Nazi, it's like it's invalid. And that was coined around this time where a lot of us leftists were like, this is you should be alarmed at the language and the way that they're using race to exploit people. And that was used to shut that down. So I think like that's a good reminder that like a lot of the policing of alarm has been going on for a while, but we've been sliding into this for some time. You could probably trace its roots to Reagan, who realized that he could lie to the press and they would still print what he said, where he would literally go to programs that he was going to cut and talk about their importance, and then propose puzzles that were cutting it. You could go to him launching his reelection bid in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where they lynched 3 civil rights workers, in the 60s, and talked about race and talked about states' rights as a clear sort of signaling that the Republican Party was going to be a white fascist party. I don't think it immediately went into that, but we're seeing sort of those roots of those decisions leading itself into today. And you have a through line between his advisor saying clearly that we couldn't use the N-word, quote, we couldn't use the N-word anymore, so we started saying other things like welfare, and like he literally, he said that, and the media dutifully printing this as if it's true, rather than doing any sort of like, maybe we should research this to find out if what this person is saying is true. To Willie Horton adds, right, there's this through line that you get to where we are today. So I think that we've, this has been a long time coming, right? Like this has been something that's been seeded in our lifetimes.
And the media aspect, like we can really dig into the media aspect, because I think people don't understand how it's possible for people to believe the 2020 election was stolen when all these media outlets are like reporting on all the there were they took it to court, and every single one of those court battles failed miserably, right? So the media has been like, no, this is a legitimate election, and yet how is it possible that people don't believe the media anymore?
Oh, this one's in terms of on the general media discussion, one book that was really good that I just finished reading, and I want to get getting down the title right. Burning Down the House, and it's Newt Gingrich, The Fall of the Speaker and the Rise of a New Republican Party, that looks at the era in the late 80s and into the early 90s, where it was kind of like Newt Gingrich was starting up, and looking at the way, the seeds of a lot of stuff that we saw with Donald Trump in terms of kind of politicking and the use of the media, dating almost kind of seeing early seeds of that with Newt Gingrich, who kind of saw something that I feel like Trump really fully embraced, of that if you can find from one of your opponents something that is probably legitimately questionable behavior, and go full bore into it and not mind one bit if you are fully hypocritical and have no grounds to be making those cases, because it doesn't matter. You, as if you're the one being a kind of framing the issue from the start, and using a kind of upping how you're talking about it, you'd be the one kind of in control. And it was a fascinating read looking at his campaign against the kind of Democratic speaker who resigned in the early 90s from a corruption issue where like Newt Gingrich had literally done the same thing of like shady book deals, and about how they were very good at that, how they became very good Republicans under Gingrich of using C-SPAN when C-SPAN came up, and the fact that you from home only see the person talking, you never realize that it's an empty room most of the time, and the kind of unfiltered way that kind of gives you was really interesting in kind of how it captured some of those points. And the other one quick starting point that I was just going to note that Jordan's comments reminded me of is one thing I would love to see kind of some type of piece analyzing is a typology of political lying. And in the way in which I feel that one thing in recent years that I feel like we've seen more of is the type of lying where there is direct, easily available counter evidence to the point being made, and the person is insisting upon it anyway. Where it's not like politicians have always forever time told the truth, but you have the type of lying that is stating opinion as fact is one type of lying. You have the type of lying that is you actually don't have the information available to disprove them. You think they're wrong, and they're relying on an imbalance of information to make a likely false claim. And you have the like massaging of the facts to the point of just like typical spin, where it's that it's not fully honest, but it has that slight string of a tether still onto the truth. But if you just kind of the ability to flat out state things that are clearly untrue is a really, against all kind of easily accessible counter evidence, is a really striking dynamic.
Yeah, and I love how you're framing this in sort of the Reagan administration. Like, I didn't become aware until the Bush administration, but under the Bush administration, it became super clear to me that the administration would just send their talking points to Fox News and all of the right-wing radio programs and a bunch of the other sort of affiliates on television and they would just get spoken like there was no editing whatsoever. It was literally, they would send their talking points over and the reporters would report it as if it was the truth. And, it seemed like it took a certain amount of time for the other media organizations to also change, right? But over time, as money got removed from newspapers and from TV in terms of their advertising dollars, as cord cutters happened, and as the internet happened, and there was less and less money for investigative research, it seemed to me that like later on, a good 15 years later, the Democrats thought to themselves, hey, why don't we just send our talking points straight to the news organizations? And we get this both sidesism, right? We get this thing where these news organizations will say, oh, well, they never have enough resources to actually try and find out what the truth is. So they just say, well, here's what the Republicans say, and here's what the Democrats say, and there you go. There's the both sides. And when both of those sides agree, like, for example, on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, then they just present it as if it's true. And nobody bothers to do any kind of investigative journalism. And in terms of how this relates to democracy, right? People, when they figure out a year or two later that what they were told by every major news organization was a lie, that really undermines the credibility of the news. It's hugely problematic.
I guess I'll say, I think we should, I don't think of it as investigative journalism to just do like Google searches. I think of investigative journalism as like showing up someplace, doing a deep dive. Like what you're talking about is they're not doing journalism. I call it stenographing. I spend a lot of time on Twitter making fun of people, and I calling them stenographers to their faces, because that's what they are, the political stenographers. They're literally copying and pasting press releases. And I'll give you one from yesterday. Data finds, quote, no support for racial disparities in traffic stops, right? This is in the Boston Globe. The Boston Globe says, the report says that there's no support of racial patterns in disparity, right? First thing it says, right? It's fixed. A 10-month study found no evidence of racial disparity, except the next in that same sentence it says, except that drivers of color were more likely to be subjected to searches, higher chances of receiving criminal citations than white drivers. That's in the sentence. So the report says racial bias, but the headline says there isn't any, and they reported it. And that's my point, is like, you don't need to platform their lies. There's no requirement that you copy and paste things which are ridiculous and not true. And this is on them. This is their, the thing is, it's not cat bites dog. It's not man bites dog things that's a problem. It's that they are interested in conflict, and they would rather print lies that are untrue, that create the sort of narrative they want, which is, the narrative that the media, because the media is super subjective. It wants one story more than any other story, which is Democrats, people are fighting, and us adults are just sort of sitting back like, oh, these children are fighting. That's the story it wants to write. And if it can write it, it will write it. It will pigeonhole anything into that thing. And so it's just like, it just does this over and over again, where it just writes lazy stuff. And, so then you get this bizarro thing, right? Where like in the first sentence of this paragraph, the Boston Globe printed this, right? In the first paragraph, it says a 10-month study of traffic were found no evidence of racial disparities in which police chose to pull over, but determined that drivers of color were more likely to be subjected. Like it's contradicting itself. It also, to be clear, by the way, when it says that there's no evidence of this, what they found is that the study found that people of color were pulled over more often in the daytime, but not in the nighttime. I wonder what that disparity, but there's no disparity, but people of color are getting pulled over more in the daytime. What happens in the daytime?
You can see.
What doesn't happen in the nighttime?
You can see it in the car.
That might add the police pulling people over more. If only there were something we could write down that could explain such a phenomenon.
Oh my God.
If only there were, like, so that's what I mean about journalism. Like, we're not even talking about, like, this is common, it's not even Googleable stuff, right? Like common sense, right? You could rewrite this to say, like, bewilderingly, Department of Health says, but Department of Policing or Public Safety says that there's no evidence of racial disparity in a report showing racial disparity. Look,
Right,
I've
exactly.
rewritten it.
Yeah.
It speaks to as well one of the points that one of the easiest ways to write an article is to rely on what was put in the press release given to you about something. It is very easy to do. It makes sense why somebody will do that. That's not actually reporting on the thing itself, to report on kind of on the press release. And it reminds me as well that there was this this is almost a decade ago, when I went to like the Roots Camp conference, and there was one woman who was presenting kind of a recent report she had for the New America Foundation on kind of the hollowing out of expert knowledge on things in Congress, and the way in which that leads to, and this kind of interfaces with the media ecosystem as well as the political ecosystem, that ends up bolstering those who have a lot of money to do lobbying, because what that is the conveyance of readily available, digestible, accessible information. And that shapes kind of the media ecosystem that comes out of it. It shapes how politicians think, and it shapes their priorities, because most of the people who get elected don't know much about the issues they work on. There are some who do. Shout out to the elected officials who have some area of expertise. Often that expertise is not even used, but most of them don't. And whether or not their values are good, like they might be good, they might be bad, they're still trying to find information on topics that they don't innately understand. And when that information is conveyed in an easily digestible way, it is more likely to be believed. And it's the same thing if you're a journalist and you're writing about a topic and you don't know about this topic. The thing that presents it in a digestible way is will be how you frame the topic, even if it is in fact wrong.
And so you get one of the major pillars of democracy, the thing that's supposed to hold up, that's important to holding up our democracy, which is somebody telling you something that you can believe, that you can understand, that
An informed public. You can't have an informed public without people informing the public.
Exactly. But not only informing them, but giving them, having sources of places that they can pull for information that they trust. And when you, when I've focus grouped and polled voters, and they'll say to you, I'll Google information like healthcare, explain it easily, and they're looking up places because they don't trust the sources that they're getting from the news media. So they don't necessarily trust it. Or they'll get a digestible 2 minutes on the local news, which is the #1 place people digest their politics. It's 2-minute bites, 1-minute bite but while they're finding out about the last night's game and the weather. And that's really where they're finding. So as that's breaking apart, that's a pillar that holds up democracy that's falling apart.
Totally. And Jordan, you were going to talk a little bit about the privatization of institutions.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to note as before I came to my current job, I worked in an organization that worked on the privatization of media companies, and most people don't realize there's only 5 companies that control nearly everything we read, see, and hear. And so the reason you're seeing this type of media coverage isn't an accident. It's reflective of the corporate buying. And the corporations, I don't think, are sort of left versus right. They're into selling conflict. They need to sell ad space. That's the only thing they care about. David Simon joked that the copy in the newspaper was the thing that interrupted the ad sales. That's the way they view a lot of their news product. It's the thing that interrupts the advertising. And so there's just, not only is there not an investment in journalism, but there's also an interest in not having journalism, not asking questions, not digging deep, not investigating the same corporations that are paying for that space, right? There's an interest in keeping things sort of status quo and having the fight be between these bickering tribes.
Yeah, and the clickbaitness, right? So everything has to be clickbait. That's the purpose of news, is to get you to click so that then you see their advertisements. Yeah.
Yep, they need their eyes.
Yeah, and I want to lead this a little bit to negative partisanship. because
Mhm.
this whole clickbait thing is about like, oh, those people are bad, and these people, only our team is the good team and their team is the bad team, and that gets people to click. And I have to mention one other thing, which I feel like people don't hear about. I wish was talked about a little bit more. Long before the pandemic, there were studies on what's called moral purity, right? So on morality, and there are like 5 different elements to morality, and one of them is purity. And it's related to our need for biological purity. And so what they did in these studies long before COVID was they would have people take a political survey, and half of the group, the control group, would just take the survey, and the other group would spray their hands with hand sanitizer before taking the survey. And the group that sprayed their hands with hand sanitizer would rank more conservative on those issues that are related to purity. So gay marriage, abortion, those kinds of things. But they would also be more purist, and they would not trust the other people who don't believe what they believe. So the fact that we are all multiple times a day hand sanitizing, wearing masks, washing our hands, taking tests, worried that we're catching a contagious disease, triggers our sense of purity. And so it makes us more likely to think that the other side, the other political side, is evil, and that our side is good. And so I am not at all surprised that we're seeing high negative partisanship, 2 years into a pandemic. And I hope that people can take a deep breath and remember that we are all being affected by this need for purity, and we're using it in a political context, probably a little bit more than necessary.
I think it's also important I always separate out sort of the leaders. I think the thing that I try to always do is separate the leaders and the people with voices and power versus regular people. So
Absolutely.
I think that's the important thing, because I do think, you need to be careful to always make clear that the Republican Party has gone down an explicitly white, ethnocentric, Nazi-esque, it's going in that direction / explicitly saying white nationalist things, and that is real and happening. And that regular people aren't those people, right? That they are trying to wade through these things. And the more that we can treat regular people as having conversations that are gettable, that are understandable, that hold conflicting views, that hold conflicting values, that are messy, like we're messy, and the more that we can try to bring them in, the better. One of the things I like to say is progressives are always about trying to get the better angels, but that does, by definition, that means there's a negative angel that's also there. And so I think we need to be, that's why people move around politically. That's why they don't stay in one place, or they choose to just piece out on it, because they hold those multitudes, they hold those complexities. People hold competing beliefs, things that totally are opposite of each other. They believe them equally. And so, you need a politics that reflects that sees them, hears them, understands them, wants them to be joining that process, that brings them in, and brings them in with their complexities, brings them in with their views that are sometimes complicated and not great, and all those things together, right? And so I think we need to hold that in there.
100%. And negative partisanship is specifically about disliking the voters of the other side, not the people at the top. 100% with you on that. I want to bring us, because it's hard to not talk about all these different aspects. But I really want to bring us to this question of what is the ultimate reason why we have a crisis in democracy? And I'm going to posit that it is really a question of power, that corporate forces, pro-corporate forces, really have the power to make the government do what they want it to do. And the vast majority of the American people do not. Even when we agree on policy, we do not have that power. And there was a great study that came out of Princeton a number of years ago. It looked at 20 years of bills that came up in Congress, bills that passed, bills that failed. And then it looked at their popularity, both among the bottom 90% of wage earners and at their popularity among the top 10% of wage earners. And it is kind of terrifying, because what it came out with is that the top 10% of wage earners have a lot of input. They have a lot of effect on policy. When they like a policy, it is very likely to pass. When they hate a policy, they have absolute veto power. So none of the policies hated by the top 10% passed. That was it.
Mhm.
They complete veto power. And the bottom 90% of people, it wasn't that we had only a little bit of effect on bills. It was like, it literally had no influence whatsoever. And the quote from the researchers was that the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy.
Mhm. And it reminds me of, just to tag quickly into that, of one point when it comes to, let's say, the impact of large money on politics. It's not just that one-to-one of somebody donating. It's also the social power and the economic power. Of the social power of, these are the people who are often of the same, are in the social circles of those who are kind of in positions of power. And the issues that you believe are important to people are the ones that are important to the people you talk with on a more frequent basis. It is a simple thing. So it's not even necessarily going to be that it's just because that they gave they're the ones who gave you money, but if they're the people that you're talking to at your children's like best friend's birthday party and everybody is talking about,
or 4 hours a day, as most
4 days
members
call,
of Congress
yeah,
do,
call
time. 4 hours a day.
Exactly. And it's even with that element of the fundraising, it's not even just the fact that they're giving you money, is that you're spending that time talking to, and they're the voices that you're hearing and the complaints that you're hearing. And then the same way that politicians will think that something, a few people who call their office, that raises the salience of how they view it in their district. That's a lot of people that they're talking with to then raise the salience of those issues, as well as the general kind of economic power that you have in a system where, even if with hollow threats, that companies are like, well, we're just gonna leave. And even if they almost never actually do, if politicians kind of call their bluff, politicians will get afraid of that economic power that corporations put, as the ones who own capital have the power to move the capital.
And I think one of the through lines between this podcast and sort of the national things and and this conversation about democracy is the inability to actually do things that people feel in their day-to-day, that they digest, the big things that make a difference in their lives. You know, one of the things I say to legislators, because they always get defensive when I talk about how the problem sort of facing how little they do, is they'll say, well, I passed this bill, we passed this bill, we passed this bill. And I said, yeah, things are doing great unless you want to get around the state, unless you want to live next to your parents, unless you want to have affordable quality childcare, unless you go to an education system that isn't in Brookline, right? Like things, and you want to get around without contributing to the environment, contributing to the environmental collapse that we're barely dealing with, right? Like, except for all those things, like, it's doing great. You're doing an awesome job. And so, like, the inability to tangibly make to make people's lives better, right? So you have a government that's not responsive, that isn't talking about the things that you care about, that then isn't delivering on your day-to-day to make it available. And then a system of educating people about that isn't educating them about any of those things, not telling them anything useful, except that people are fighting. Right, it's the only thing it'll cover is that people are fighting, because that's, again, what it wants to do, to sell clickbait, to get your serotonin up, to try to keep you on Facebook, to try to keep those things. So you have this broken system that's finally starting to collapse on itself. And the anecdote to that has always been progressive. For us, it's been clear that the answer is progressive legislation. You need to pass things to make people's lives better.
Yes.
You want people to be invested in government. Government needs to do big things. It needs to do big things to address the things to make their lives better. If it never does anything that they feel, see, or feel like they've voted, they've engaged, and then it led to something positive, then they will stop believing in that system. And so that's the thing that we need to do to get moving.
When I was running for office, I would not always, I would talk to a lot of people, right? Not always the people who voted the most. I purposely went to like the public housing, places in town and, really trying to talk to everybody. And boy, there are people, the people that you expect, right? The people that we try to get to register to vote, marginalized communities, people of color, people of low income. And they are very clear when you talk to them. They say, I will never vote. I'm never going to vote because none of those people are ever going to do anything for me. They've never done anything for me. They're never going to do anything for me. It's a waste of my time. And then they also say, but if I ever voted, I'd vote for you. Because what are you doing here? Like, why are you here? Like, no one ever talks to them, ever. No one ever goes. And, we have to be able to pass policy if we're going to be able to, do anything. Jordan, I love your quote about that Titanic. Go jump in, say the Titanic one, because that's my favorite.
Well, it's just like, I say this to legislators all the time, which is, what you're telling me is that the Titanic is going down and you're putting patches in, like you're at the margins trying to make things better. You're putting some patches up, but the Titanic is going down. So don't tell me how good the band is playing while the Titanic is going down. Like, I don't need to hear that. Like, we have big things. Stop trying to put patchwork and be like, look at this tune we're playing.
Yeah. And I also love to talk about this as like, I think people who are really active in politics, they can't imagine not voting. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what's wrong with these people, right? And I want you to think about, imagine that you're like not into football and a friend invites you to a football game to root for their team. And you go, you sit in the stands and the other team is like driving the ball down the field. They're like playing really aggressively. They get finally to your own team's 10-yard line. And then finally your team starts to they start to really play. And like you jump up and down the stands and you cheer. And it's exciting the first time or two, but they never push the ball forward. They never score a single goal. And you know what? The other team's fans, they're having a great time. They're hooting and hollering because they're scoring points. But by the 6th, 7th time that you get to your own 10-yard line and the other side has like 20 points, they're 20 points up, like I just go home. I'm not going to stay at that game. Like, why would I even bother to watch? And I think, unfortunately, the progressives in the Democratic Party are not in power enough to be able to pass policy. And the powerful group inside the Democratic Party, both here in Massachusetts as well as nationally, they are not interested in passing the policies that they promised to pass.
Yeah, or serious enough about winning elections, I would say, to try to actually, figure out how to, they're interested in staying in power, staying with, people, the politicians. They're not interested in figuring out tackling these big questions about how do we get all these people who aren't voting in? How do we create infrastructure in places around the country, not just in swing states, right? These big things that the Republican Party does. Training people in Alaska to run for school committee so that they then become mayor and then vice president, right? These long-term investments, they're haphazard, they're a little everywhere, they're not well planned out, they're not well positioned. And so they're just not interested in those things. And then to go back to this piece around where people get their news, right? If you only have 2 minutes, what's the news going to talk about? It's not going to talk about a patchwork policy you put together for one small group. It's going to talk about a big thing or an easily quotable politician or some sort of personal fight, right? Like a picadillo, somebody sleeping with somebody's not their partner, right? Like they're going to pick those things over those boring, barely understandable policies. But if you fought a big issue, that would be the thing they'd lead with. And that's where people are getting their information. And so like that combination together is missing, right? Like it's just none of those things together.
It also, I think, speaks to as well the fact that, like, yes, there are many policy issues that cannot be readily explained to people, but politicians should be able to both do things and communicate things that voters can actually understand. Because if you want to be rewarded for something, you both have to have accomplished something and be able to tell people what it is that you accomplished. That is something that they can understand in the context of their own life, about how that makes their experience of kind of existing in the world somehow better.
Yeah, what a crazy idea that we actually make people's lives better. What? How can we win? Let's see.
Yeah.
How about actually making people's lives better?
I'll tell really quickly this. One of my favorite stories about this was Senator Merkley from Oregon was nice enough to talk with me and a few other progressive folks in Massachusetts. And so for people who don't remember, Oregon used to be a red state not that long ago in the 90s. And Senator Merkley had a position not dissimilar from mine, running a coalition of groups to try to make, to help progressives win elections. And one of the things he said is, when we first had this plan together to try to fix Oregon, the thing we knew was once we got power, we had to pass things to make people's lives better. Because once we had a little bit of power, we needed to prove that it was worth taking a chance on us. And that's been the process that they did to turn a really red state much bluer, is they did things to actually make the people of Oregon's lives better. And then people are like, oh, well, I want those people then because they're doing things, right? And so it's really funny to say this, but that's the sauce. You need to do easily understandable big things to tackle the big systemic issues that people face on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Great. Boy, this has been a nice long one, and we're going to close it up, but look forward to another episode where we talk about a strategy for how we flip power, right? We don't have the power as the people who actually vote and are supposedly live in a democracy. Like, bunch of powerful few and corporations do have power. How can we flip that? We're going to talk about that another time. Thanks, everybody. Always good to see you. We'll see everybody next week.